She said no to $5,000. $5,000 she desperately needed. $5,000 that could have paid for her sister's heart medication, kept the electricity running, stopped the debt collectors from calling every single day. The stranger pushed the stack of bills toward her, his gray eyes cold as steel, but his voice rough with something she couldn't name. Take it. You spent 4 hours stitching me back together in the dark. Clara Bennett pushed the money back across her sewing table, her hands still stained with his blood. I don't take money from people who are bleeding. He stared at her like she was the strangest creature he had ever encountered. Maybe she was. Her bank account had $173. The electricity was getting cut off Friday. Her 14-year-old sister needed heart surgery that cost $80,000. The loan sharks had threatened to burn down her shop, but something in his storm-gray eyes, something beneath all that ice and danger, reminded her that kindness means nothing if you only give it when it's easy. He left at 4 a.m, disappearing into the rain like a ghost. She went to bed believing she had done the right thing, not knowing she had just saved the life of Adrian Corsetti, the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast, a man whose enemies and the FBI alike had been trying to kill for years. The next morning, 6 black Maybachs lined her narrow street in South Boston. 12 men in dark suits surrounded her tiny shop, and Clara Bennett realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. But let us go back to that morning before the Maybachs arrived, before the devil himself walked back into her life, before Clara Bennett learned that sometimes saving a stranger in the dark doesn't just feel right, it changes your entire destiny. If this story satisfies your soul, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story where ordinary people do extraordinary things. Sometimes, the most dangerous man in the world finds his salvation in the kindest heart he has ever known. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 in the morning. Clara Bennett opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling of the small room above the tailor shop. A new day. Another fight for survival. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of Sophie's breathing from the narrow bed across the room. Her sister was only 14. Too young to fully understand the weight pressing down on her older sister's shoulders. Too young to know that the small heart inside her chest was already counting down its days. Clara reached for the old phone on the bedside table. The screen lit up, cold and unforgiving. She opened the banking app even though she already knew what number would be waiting for her. $173. Unchanged. No miracle had happened overnight. She scrolled down to the debts. Rent overdue by 15 days, $1,200. The electric bill, $350, due on Friday. Sophie's heart medication for this month, $200. Their mother's medical debt still standing at $28,000. And the largest one, the number that had stolen sleep from her night after night, the cost of Sophie's heart surgery, $80,000. Dr. Morrison had been very clear the week before. 6 months. Sophie had 6 months before her heart couldn't endure any longer. 6 months to find $80,000. Clara did the math in her head the way she had done hundreds of times before. With the average income from the tailor shop, it would take her 20 years to save that amount. Sophie didn't have 20 years. Sophie only had 6 months. She set the phone down and turned to look at her sister. Sophie lay curled beneath a thin blanket, brown hair spread softly across the pillow. Her face was peaceful in sleep, untouched by worry. The girl didn't know that Clara had sold their mother's ring the month before to pay for her medicine. She didn't know that her sister was eating only 1 meal a day to save money. She didn't know that every night, after she fell asleep, Clara sat at the sewing table and cried without making a sound. Clara rose carefully, making sure the bed didn't creak. The room was cold. She had turned off the heat 2 months ago to save money. Both sisters slept in sweaters. Sophie never complained. She was understanding in a way that hurt. Clara walked to the window and looked down at the street, still wrapped in darkness. South Boston. Poor, dangerous, but home. The place where their mother had built the tailor shop from nothing. The place where Clara had grown up, surrounded by the hum of sewing machines and the scent of fresh fabric. Now their mother was gone. Cancer had taken her 2 years earlier, leaving Clara with a mountain of medical debt and a little sister with a fragile heart. Clara closed her eyes and fought back the tears. She couldn't cry. There wasn't time to cry. She had to be strong, for Sophie, for the tailor shop, for the promise she had made to her mother on that hospital bed. I'll take care of her. I'll keep the shop. I'll live with kindness, just like you taught me. But her mother hadn't told her how hard it would be to live with kindness when her pockets were empty and the future was blurred beyond recognition. The sound of Sophie shifting in her sleep pulled Clara back to the present. She turned and saw that her sister was still sleeping deeply. Her chest rose and fell gently, just a little faster than normal, a sign of a heart working too hard. Clara stood there, watching her, and wondered for the millionth time what she would do if she lost Sophie. She didn't have an answer. She only knew that it wasn't allowed to happen, no matter what she had to do. Clara walked down to the kitchen when the clock showed 6 in the morning. The small kitchen was bitterly cold, weak light from an aging bulb falling onto the cracks along the walls. She opened the refrigerator and stood there, staring into the emptiness. 2 eggs, a little butter almost gone, the last piece of bread already beginning to harden. She closed the refrigerator and drew in a deep breath. This was everything left until she received money from the next order. Clara began to make breakfast. 2 eggs, beaten and poured into an old pan. The smell of eggs spread through the tiny kitchen, an ordinary scent that somehow made her want to cry. Her mother used to make eggs for the 2 of them every morning. Her mother always said breakfast was the most important meal of the day. Now breakfast was the only meal Clara could be sure Sophie would eat until she was full. Light footsteps sounded on the stairs. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair still messy, eyes heavy with sleep, already dressed in her school uniform. Her 14-year-old sister was smaller than girls her age because her body had to pour all its strength into keeping her fragile heart beating. "Good morning, sis." Sophie's voice was hoarse from sleep. "Morning." Clara forced the brightest smile she could manage. "Sit down. It's almost ready." She divided the eggs onto 2 plates. Sophie's portion was twice the size of hers. Clara placed the last piece of bread on her sister's plate and spread the remaining butter over it. Sophie looked down at the 2 plates, her brown eyes dimming for a moment. "You're eating too little. I'm not very hungry," Clara lied. "I ate a lot last night." A lie. The night before, she had only drunk a glass of water and gone to sleep. Sophie didn't say anything else, but Clara knew she didn't believe her. Her sister was smart, too smart to be fooled by clumsy lies like that, but she was also understanding enough not to call them out. While Sophie ate, Clara stood and cleared the counter. Her hand brushed against a wrinkled piece of paper hidden beneath a stack of bills. She picked it up, her heart tightening as she read the bold letters at the top. Science Summer Camp Application. Participation fee $700. It was a program for outstanding students who wanted to pursue medicine. Sophie had always dreamed of becoming a doctor. She wanted to heal people like herself, children born with imperfect hearts. Clara looked at the form and saw that all the information had been carefully filled in with Sophie's neat handwriting. But the parent signature line was still blank. Sophie had completed everything, but hadn't dared ask her to sign it, because she knew $700 was money her sister didn't have. Clara set the paper down, her eyes burning. She turned back to the table and looked at Sophie's feet. The sneakers she was wearing were worn thin, the big toe almost pushing through. Clara had noticed them the week before but had pretended not to see, because even a basic new pair would cost at least $65. $65 she didn't have. $700 for the camp she didn't have. $80,000 for the surgery she had no idea how to find. Clara sat down across from her sister and watched Sophie finish the eggs on her plate. Her sister was too thin, too pale, but her eyes were still bright, still filled with hope for a future she might never reach if Clara didn't find a way. "Are you done?" Clara asked, her voice steady as if her heart wasn't breaking apart. "I'm done, sis." Sophie stood up and carried her plate to the sink. She turned back, hesitating. "Sis, I'm heading to school," Sophie said, then paused as if she wanted to say something more. In the end, she only smiled and walked out the door. Clara watched her sister disappear down the street, torn shoes tapping softly against the sidewalk. She picked up the summer camp application, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. She would find a way. She had to find a way. Clara cleared the breakfast table and then changed her clothes for work. She put on an old shirt that had faded with time and a pair of fabric pants her mother had sewn for her many years ago. The stitching was still strong, still beautiful, even though the color had been worn thin by the years. Her mother used to say that a good seam could last a lifetime. Clara walked down the narrow staircase leading to the tailor shop. Each step creaked familiarly beneath her feet, a sound she had heard throughout all 27 years of her life. Bennett Tailoring sat on the ground floor of the small house, its front facing the poor street of South Boston. Her mother had opened this shop 40 years earlier, when she was only 20, with nothing but an old sewing machine and her skilled hands. Clara turned on the lights, and a warm yellow glow filled the small room. Everything looked exactly as it had when her mother was still alive. Rolls of fabric neatly stacked on the shelves. A wooden box of needles and thread that her grandfather had made for her mother. The Singer sewing machine from 1982, older than Clara herself, still standing at the center like a loyal companion. She rested her hand on the machine, feeling the cold metal beneath her palm. This machine had witnessed thousands of garments come to life. It had watched Clara grow from a 7-year-old girl sitting beside her mother, learning each stitch into the 27-year-old woman she was now. It had watched her mother sit here sewing late into the night to earn enough to raise 2 daughters. And it had witnessed her mother's chair sitting empty after the day she was gone. On the wall behind the counter, an old frame hung quietly. Clara stepped closer and looked up at the yellowed newspaper clipping. The bold headline was still readable. Local tailor saves wedding day. The photograph showed her mother, needle and thread in hand, smiling brightly. The article told the story of a poor bride whose wedding dress had been torn apart just 2 hours before the ceremony. No tailor shop would take the job because it was too rushed. Desperate, the bride had run into Clara's mother's shop, crying and begging. Her mother had dropped everything she was doing and sewn nonstop for 2 hours. When the bride asked how much it would cost, her mother had only shaken her head and smiled. Today you need a miracle, not a bill. Clara touched the frame, her fingers trembling as they traced her mother's face. I miss you, Mom, she whispered. I'm trying to live the way you taught me, but it's so hard, Mom. Her mother was the best woman she had ever known. She never refused to help anyone, even when she had little herself. She believed that kindness was the one thing that never lost its value. Every night before bed, she used to tell Clara that a person could be poor in money, but never poor in heart. That giving didn't make you poorer. It made you rich in a way no one could ever steal. Clara drew in a deep breath and held back the tears threatening to spill. She walked to the door and flipped the sign from closed to open. A new day had begun. She would keep doing what her mother had done, sewing, helping people, and trying to live with kindness in a world that wasn't very kind. Even though her account held only $173, even though her sister needed $80,000 to live, even though everything around her seemed to be falling apart, Clara Bennett would still be her mother's daughter. She would still keep her promise. The morning passed slowly. Clara sat beside the Singer sewing machine, finishing an order left unfinished from the day before. An evening gown that needed to be taken in at the waist for Mrs. Patterson, a regular customer from the next block. $25. The money had been paid in advance, and had already been spent on Sophie's medication the week before. The doorbell rang at 9. Clara looked up and saw a familiar figure step inside. Mrs. Romano, 72 years old, an Italian widow living alone in the last apartment on the street. She had come to this shop since Clara's mother was still alive. More than 30 years of loyalty. Good morning, Mrs. Romano. Clara stood and smiled. What can I do for you today? Mrs. Romano walked to the counter, her aged eyes red as if she had been crying. She placed a black dress on the table, her hands trembling. Clara, my dear, I need this dress altered. It's urgent. Clara looked at the dress, then at the sorrow on the old woman's face. What happened, Mrs. Romano? Mrs. Romano blinked, and a tear slid down her wrinkled cheek. Margaret is gone, dear. Yesterday. Clara's heart clenched. Margaret had been Mrs. Romano's closest friend. They had known each other since they were young, immigrated from Italy together, worked in the same garment factory, lost their husbands, grown old side by side. She passed in her sleep, Mrs. Romano continued, her voice breaking. The funeral is the day after tomorrow. This is the only dress I have left, but it's too loose now. I've lost so much weight. Clara lifted the dress and examined it quickly. The waist needed to be taken in, the shoulders adjusted, the hemline fixed. About 2 hours of work. The normal price would be $20. She looked at Mrs. Romano, at the thin, trembling hands, at the eyes swollen from tears. The old woman lived on social assistance, barely enough each month to eat properly. $10 is enough, Mrs. Romano, Clara said. You can pick it up this afternoon? $10? Mrs. Romano was surprised. But dear, your work. Clara shook her head and smiled. You've been a customer for decades. This is a family price, Mrs. Romano took Clara's hand, tears spilling again. You're just like your mother. Too kind. May God bless you. When Mrs. Romano left, Clara looked down at the black dress in her hands. $10. Not enough to buy a proper meal for the two of them, but she couldn't take more from an old woman who had just lost her closest friend. At 11, the bell rang again. Mr. Walsh walked in, 80 years old, a veteran, leaning on a cane. He lived alone in a small apartment a few blocks away, surviving on a modest military pension. "Morning, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I need a small favor." Clara stood and pulled out a chair for him. "What do you need, Mr. Walsh?" He placed an old vest on the counter. The shoulders were worn, the color faded, but it had been carefully kept. One button had come loose, lying in the pocket. "My grandson is about to enlist," Mr. Walsh said slowly. "He wants me to attend the oath ceremony. This is the only jacket I own. I want to look decent when I see him." Clara looked at the vest, then at the button in his hand. A 5-minute job. The usual price was $5, but she looked into his eyes and saw the pride when he spoke of his grandson, and the worry of not knowing if he had enough money. "There's no charge, Mr. Walsh," Clara said softly. "It's just a small thing." Mr. Walsh tried to protest, but Clara had already picked up the vest, sat down at the machine, and begun to sew. 5 minutes later, the button was secured more firmly than ever. She handed the vest back and poured him a cup of coffee from the small pot she brewed every morning. Mr. Walsh accepted the coffee, his old eyes glistening. "You're just like your mother, Clara. She never let anyone leave with worry in their heart." Clara smiled, even as her heart felt heavy. "My mother taught me that money can be poor, but the heart must never be." Mr. Walsh shook his head, looking at her with both concern and affection. "But you have to take care of yourself too, child. You can't keep giving like this forever." Clara didn't answer. She only smiled and walked him to the door. When he disappeared down the street, she turned back to the small cash box beneath the counter. $47 in cash, the total earnings from all of yesterday. With the $10 from Mrs. Romano later that day, she would have $57. Still $293 short to pay the electric bill before Friday. Still short an entire fortune to save her sister's life. 10 minutes after Mr. Walsh left, the phone rang. Clara looked at the number, and her heart sank. She knew that number. It had called every day for the past 2 months. The debt collection agency. She considered not answering, but they would call again. They always did. It was better to face it once and be done. "Bennett Tailoring, this is Clara." She tried to keep her voice steady. "Miss Bennett, I am calling from Patterson Debt Recovery." The voice on the other end was cold, mechanical, without emotion. "The medical debt of Eleanor Bennett, $28,000, has been overdue for 18 months. Clara closed her eyes. Her mother had been gone for 2 years, but the bills still chased her like ghosts. "I know," she said quietly. "I am trying to pay it little by little." "You have been saying that for 18 months, Miss Bennett." The voice grew sharper. "We have been patient long enough. If we don't receive a minimum payment of $5,000 within 30 days, we will proceed with legal action. Your assets, including the tailor shop, will be seized. $5,000. 30 days. Clara felt her head spin. She didn't have $5,000. She didn't even have enough to pay the electric bill this week. "I will try," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Don't try. Do it." The line went dead. Clara set the phone down, her hands shaking. She looked around the shop, the place her mother had spent her entire life building. If she lost this place, she would lose everything. Her home, her livelihood, the last piece of her mother's legacy. The phone rang again. Clara glanced at the number. It wasn't the debt collectors. It was the hospital. Her heart began to race as she picked up. "Miss Bennett? This is Dr. Morrison's office." "Yes, I'm here," Clara said, her voice already rough. "Dr. Morrison would like to speak with you about Sophie's most recent test results. Please hold." A click. Then Dr. Morrison's voice came on the line. "Clara, I have some bad news." Clara gripped the edge of the counter, her legs threatening to give way. "The test results show that Sophie's heart condition is worsening faster than we anticipated. The valve leakage is more severe. We need to move up the surgery timeline." "How much sooner?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. 3 months, Dr. Morrison said. "That is the maximum window. If the surgery doesn't happen within 3 months, Sophie's heart won't be able to endure it. The cost remains $80,000 as discussed. Insurance will cover part of it, but you will still need to secure approximately $65,000 on your own." "Clara, I know this is a huge amount, but this is Sophie's life." Clara couldn't speak. She murmured something and ended the call. $65,000. 3 months. She collapsed into the old chair, staring at the empty shop. Her mother's photograph on the wall seemed to be watching her. "Mom, what am I supposed to do?" she whispered as tears streamed down her face. "I don't know what to do anymore. $5,000 in 30 days to keep the shop. $350 before Friday to keep the lights on. $65,000 in 3 months to save Sophie. And she had only $173 in her account." Clara buried her face in her hands and cried without a sound. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like she was drowning with nothing and no one left to hold on to. Clara hadn't even wiped her tears dry when the shop bell rang again. Not the usual polite chime of a customer, but a violent, relentless ringing, as if whoever stood outside wanted to tear the door off its hinges. She looked up, her blood turning cold when she saw the figures through the glass. 3 men. She recognized the one in front instantly. Jimmy Kowalski. People called him Jimmy the Rat, the leader of the Jackals, the gang that controlled all of South Boston. He was tall and thin, with a long rat-like face and narrow eyes that were always calculating how much money he could squeeze out of someone. Clara stood up, forcing her legs not to shake. She knew this day would come. She had delayed it for 2 months, but she couldn't delay it forever. The door flew open. Jimmy stepped in first, his 2 enforcers close behind. They were big men with hard faces and tattooed arms. One carried a baseball bat. The other kept his hand inside his jacket as if hiding something. Clara knew what it was. She didn't want to think about it. "Good morning, tailor lady," Jimmy said with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Long time no see. 2 months already, right?" Clara stood behind the counter, resting her hand on the sewing machine as if drawing strength from it. "I don't have the money," she said flatly. "I already told you. No money?" Jimmy walked closer, the smell of cheap alcohol and cigarettes hitting her nose. He looked around the shop, his gaze lingering on the rolls of fabric, on the sewing machine, on her mother's photograph on the wall. "The shop is still open. The lights are on. You're still breathing. That means there's money somewhere." Clara clenched her teeth. "I don't even have enough to pay the electric bill this week. Where do you think I'd get $500? Jimmy clicked his tongue and gestured to one of his men. The man walked to the fabric shelf and picked up Clara's scissors. He opened them and slowly sliced a long cut through the silk roll Clara had bought on installment the month before. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the silence. Clara wanted to scream, wanted to run forward and snatch the scissors away, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. That roll of fabric was worth $80. $80, she didn't have to replace it. "You see," Jimmy said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "We don't like violence. We just want to do business. $500 a month and we protect you. No one bothers you. No one smashes your shop. Simple, right?" Clara swallowed. "And if I don't have the money?" Jimmy sighed as if she'd asked a stupid question. He nodded to the other man. The man walked to the corner where Clara had piled unpaid bills and letters. He picked one up and read aloud. "Medical bills. $28,000. Wow," he whistled. "And this one. Hospital letters. Heart surgery. $80,000. You've got a sick sister, tailor lady?" Clara lunged to grab the papers, but Jimmy was faster. He blocked her, gripping her wrist and squeezing hard. Clara gasped in pain. "Easy there," Jimmy said, his face inches from hers. "I don't want to make things hard for you, but you need to understand the rules. Every shop on this street pays protection. You're not special." "I don't have the money," Clara said through clenched teeth, tears burning but held back. "Please, I really don't have it." Jimmy released her and stepped back. He slipped his hand into his pocket, tilting his head as if thinking. "All right," he said. "I'll give you one more day. Tomorrow night, 10 o'clock, $500. If not," his eyes wandered around the shop and stopped on the old wooden ceiling. "You know what happened to Mr. Chen's grocery store down the street, don't you?" Clara knew. Everyone did. Mr. Chen's shop had burned down the week before. The police said it was faulty wiring. But everyone knew the truth. "Old wood burns fast," Jimmy said casually, "especially on dry nights like these. And you've got a little sister living upstairs, right? It'd be a shame if something happened." Clara felt the blood drain from her body. He was threatening Sophie. He dared threaten her sister. She wanted to scream at him, to claw his face, but she knew that would only make things worse. All she could do was stand there, trembling, as Jimmy and his men walked out. "Tomorrow night, 10 o'clock, Jimmy said over his shoulder. "Don't disappoint me, tailor lady." The door slammed shut. Clara was alone in the shop, her legs finally giving out. She sank to the floor, staring at the ruined silk fabric and the scattered bills. $500. Tomorrow. She didn't have $500. She had no way to get $500 in one day, and if she didn't, they'd burn the shop. They'd hurt Sophie. Clara buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with fear and despair. But she didn't cry. She'd cried too much already today. Tears didn't save anyone. She had to find a way. She had to protect Sophie. No matter what she had to do, the afternoon dragged by in fear. Clara tried to finish Mrs. Romano's dress, but her hands shook so badly that she had to rip the seams out and redo them 3 times. Her mind couldn't stay on the stitches while Jimmy's words echoed over and over in her head. Old wood burns fast. And you've got a little sister living upstairs, right? Sophie came home at 4 in the afternoon, cheerful, talking about a math test she had aced. Clara forced a smile, hiding the fear gnawing at her from the inside. She couldn't let Sophie know. She couldn't let her sister worry when her heart was already fragile enough. Dinner was instant noodles. Clara lied and said she wasn't hungry, giving her portion to Sophie. The girl finished eating, did her homework, and went to bed early because she had gym class the next day. Clara kissed her forehead, wished her good night, and went back downstairs to the tailor shop. She couldn't sleep, not because she wasn't exhausted, but because every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames. She saw the shop burning. She saw Sophie trapped upstairs. At 10 o'clock, rain began to fall. At first it was a light drizzle. Then it quickly turned into a heavy downpour. Thunder cracked across the sky, white light tearing through the darkness. Clara sat by the sewing machine, staring through the glass door. Rain streamed along the street, washing trash into the gutters. The street was empty, not a soul in sight. She thought about tomorrow, about the $500 she didn't have, about Jimmy and his threat. Could she run? Take Sophie somewhere else and start over? But where would they go? With what money? And Sophie needed surgery. She needed a hospital. She needed Dr. Morrison. Clara couldn't run. 10:47. A knock sounded at the door. Clara jumped, her heart pounding wildly. Who would knock at this hour? Had Jimmy come back early? Or one of his men sent to scare her again? The knock came again. Faster. More desperate. This wasn't the knock of someone here to threaten. It was the knock of someone who needed help. Clara stood, her feet carrying her to the door. But she didn't open it. She looked through the rain-fogged glass. A figure. Tall. Leaning against the doorframe, as if about to collapse. Is someone there? Clara asked through the door. Please. The voice came through. Hoarse. Broken. Please help me. I've got nowhere else to go. I saw your light was on. Please. Clara hesitated. A woman alone. Late at night. A dangerous neighborhood. Every survival instinct screamed at her not to open the door. But that voice, there was nothing threatening in it. Only pain. Real desperation. She opened the door a crack, keeping the safety chain on, and she saw him. A man, maybe in his mid-30s, tall, broad-shouldered, his features sharp as if carved from stone, dark hair plastered wetly to his forehead. But what froze Clara wasn't his face. It was his eyes. Storm gray, cold as steel, yet deep inside them something was breaking apart, and the blood soaking through the white shirt at his left shoulder, mixing with rain, and running down his arm in dark red streams. Oh my God, Clara whispered. You're hurt. The man nodded, his face tightening with pain. Please, he said, his voice weaker. Don't call the police. Don't call an ambulance. Just bandage it. I'll pay, whatever it costs. Clara looked at him, at the blood spreading wider, at the gray eyes dimming from blood loss. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he was hurt. She didn't know why he didn't want the police. But she knew one thing. He was bleeding. He needed help. And her mother had taught her that when someone needs help, you help them. No questions. No judgment. Just help. Clara unlatched the chain and opened the door. The man nearly collapsed inside, one hand gripping the doorframe to stay upright. Clara slipped her shoulder under his uninjured arm and guided him in. He was heavy, nearly a head taller than her. The sharp smell of blood filled her nose, mixed with rain and something else. Gunpowder. She recognized it from the movies Sophie liked to watch. She sat him down on the chair beside the sewing table, then hurried to lock the door. When she turned back, she saw him watching her. Those piercing gray eyes, as if trying to read what kind of person she was. Who are you? He asked, his voice still rough but tinged with curiosity. Clara looked down at the wound on his shoulder. Blood was still flowing, soaking half his shirt. She had no medical supplies, no medicine, only needles, thread, and hands that had been sewing for 20 years. "I'm a tailor," Clara said, reaching for her tools, "and you're bleeding on my shop floor. The rest of the questions can wait." Clara ran into the back room and rummaged through an old cabinet. She didn't have medical bandages, no proper antiseptic, only a cheap bottle of alcohol she used to clean the sewing machines, a few gauze pads left over from when Sophie fell off her bicycle, and the box of needles and thread her mother had left behind. She gathered everything in her arms and hurried back out, placing it on the sewing table beside the man. He was slumped against the chair, eyes shut tight, his face pale from blood loss. But when he heard her footsteps, he opened his eyes. The gray gaze was still sharp, still unnervingly alert despite how exhausted his body was. "I need to look at the wound," Clara said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Can you take off your shirt?" The man nodded and tried to lift his hand to undo the buttons, but his fingers trembled too much to manage. Clara stepped closer, hesitated for a second, then placed her hands on the row of buttons. "Let me," she said quietly. She unbuttoned the shirt one button at a time, deliberately avoiding his eyes, which followed every movement she made. When the shirt was pulled open, she drew in a sharp breath. The wound was on his left shoulder, just beneath the collarbone. A round, torn opening, blood still seeping out. Clara wasn't a doctor, but she had seen enough films and read enough to know this was a gunshot wound. "Is the bullet still inside?" she asked. "No," he replied through clenched teeth. "It went through. Exit wound in the back." Clara moved behind him to check. Just as he said, there was another hole on the back of his shoulder, smaller than the one in front. At least she wouldn't have to dig a bullet out. But both wounds were bleeding and both needed attention. "I'm not a doctor," Clara said plainly. "I'm just a tailor. I can stitch it closed, but I can't guarantee it won't get infected. You need a hospital." "No hospital," he said, his voice hard as steel, despite the pain. "No police. Do what you can. If I die, that's not on you." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say she didn't want anyone dying in her shop, but she looked into his eyes and understood he wouldn't change his mind. Whatever had happened to him was serious enough that he would rather die than let the police know. "All right," she said. "Bite down. This is going to hurt." She poured alcohol onto a gauze pad and pressed it against the front wound. The man hissed, muscles bunching in his uninjured arm as he fought the pain. But he didn't scream. He didn't thrash. He just clenched his teeth and endured it. Clara cleaned the blood around the wound, then did the same to the one in back. When the alcohol hit raw flesh, she saw him grip the edge of the chair until his knuckles turned white. Still, not a sound. She took out a needle, choosing a curved one meant for heavy material. The thread was strong nylon, the kind she used for handbags. Not ideal, but the best she had. She passed the needle through a lighter flame to sterilize it, then threaded it. Her hands shook. She had sewn thousands of stitches on fabric, but this was the first time she had ever sewn human skin. She took a deep breath and tried to remember what her mother had taught her. Each stitch had to be even, secure, precise, no shaking hands. She pushed the needle through the edge of the wound. The man sucked in a sharp breath, but stayed silent. Clara kept going, one stitch at a time, pulling the edges of skin together. Then the lights went out. The shop plunged into darkness. Clara froze, the needle still embedded in his skin. She could hear her own breathing, the rain pounding outside, thunder rumbling in the distance. Friday. Today was Friday. The electric company had warned they would cut the power if she didn't pay. She hadn't paid. And now, in the middle of stitching a stranger's gunshot wound, the electricity was gone. What happened? The man's voice came out of the darkness. "The power was cut," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I couldn't pay the bill." She stood up and felt her way through the dark to the drawer beside the register. She remembered she still had a few old candles, saved for sudden outages. Her hand found the candles, then the lighter. A small flame flared to life. She lit 3 candles and placed them around the sewing table. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows along the walls. The man's face appeared and disappeared in the warm yellow glow. He was watching her. "You couldn't pay the electric bill," he said, not as a question, but a statement. "And you still opened your door to a bleeding stranger. You're strange. You know that." Clara didn't answer. She sat back down and picked up the needle again. The candlelight was just enough for her to see the wound, but she had to lean in close, strain her eyes. She kept sewing, stitch by careful stitch in the unsteady light. An hour passed. She finished the front wound, 12 neat stitches. She moved behind him and started on the back. This one was smaller, only 8 stitches, but the position was harder. She had to kneel, angle the candles to get enough light. The man sat perfectly still, letting her work. Occasionally she heard him inhale sharply as the needle pierced his skin, but he never cried out. His pain tolerance wasn't normal. 2 hours later, Clara tied the final knot. She leaned back and looked at her work. 2 clean rows of stitches, not as perfect as a surgeon's, but solid and clean. She had done everything she could. "It's done," she said, exhausted. "You need to rest. Don't move your shoulder for at least a few days." The man turned to look at her. In the candlelight, his gray eyes were no longer as cold as before. There was something else there. "You just did something no surgeon would agree to do," he said quietly. "You stitched a gunshot wound with sewing needles, by candlelight, in a tailor shop with no power. And you still haven't asked my name." Clara looked down at her hands, blood-stained, trembling, but steady. "Your name isn't important," she said. "You needed help. I could help, that's all." The man was silent for a long moment, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Then he spoke, so softly she almost didn't hear it. "Adrian. My name is Adrian." "Clara," she replied after a brief silence. "Clara Bennett." Adrian nodded as if he were committing the name to some deep place in his memory. He remained seated, his back against the chair, his eyes never leaving her. Candlelight cast shifting shadows across his face, sharpening the hard line of his cheekbones, and revealing a faint scar running along his temple that she hadn't noticed before. Clara stood and went to fetch a glass of water from the jug she kept in the back room. She handed it to Adrian, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment. Cold. He'd lost a lot of blood. "Drink," she said. "You need fluids." Adrian took the glass and drank slowly, one careful sip at a time, his gray eyes watching her over the rim. When he finished, he set the glass down and tilted his head, looking around the tailor shop in the candlelight. "Is this your shop?" "My mother's," Clara said as she lowered herself into the chair across from him, the rush of exhaustion finally crashing over her now that the urgency had passed. "She opened it 40 years ago. She passed away 2 years ago." Adrian's gaze settled on the framed photograph on the wall, the old newspaper article about Clara's mother. In the dim light, she couldn't tell if he could read the words, but he studied it for a long time. "What was your mother like?" he asked, his voice different now, softer, as if the question mattered to him in a way he didn't fully understand. Clara looked up at the picture where her mother smiled with a needle in her hand. "She was the best person I ever knew," she said quietly. "She never refused to help anyone, even when she had nothing herself. She believed kindness was the only thing you could give away without ever losing it. She taught me that when someone needs help, you help them. You don't ask who they are. You don't ask if they deserve it. You just help." "Why?" Adrian asked, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to grasp a foreign idea. "Why believe that?" "Because it's the only way to live without losing yourself," Clara answered. "This world is cruel enough already. If I become cruel too, then how am I any different from it?" Adrian fell silent. He looked down at his hands marked with calluses and scars Clara didn't dare ask about. Then his eyes drifted to the scattered bills on the counter near the register, the ones Jimmy's men had tossed around earlier that day. "You're in debt," he said, not as a question. "I saw the medical bills, $30,000. My mother had cancer," Clara said, surprised at how easily the words came to a man she'd only just met. Maybe it was the darkness, maybe the candles, maybe because she'd carried everything alone for too long and needed someone to hear it, no matter who that someone was. "She fought for 2 years. Insurance wasn't enough. The savings ran out. Then she died and left me with the debt, and my sister." "Your sister?" Clara nodded, her eyes burning as she thought of Sophie sleeping upstairs. "Sophie, 14 years old. She was born with a heart condition. She needs surgery within 3 months. $80,000, Clara said, her voice catching. "I don't know where it's going to come from. I work every day, but it's never enough. It's never enough." Adrian stared at her. There was something in those gray eyes Clara couldn't read. Shock, confusion, or something deeper. "You're drowning in debt," he said slowly. "Your sister needs money to live. You can't even pay your electric bill, and yet you still opened your door to a bleeding stranger. You still spent 4 hours stitching his wounds. Why?" "Because you needed help," Clara replied simply. "And I could help. But you don't know who I am. I could be a murderer, a criminal, someone who might hurt you." Clara met his gaze without flinching. Are you going to hurt me? Adrian blinked, as if the question caught him off guard. No. Then whatever you do outside this tailor shop isn't my concern, Clara said. All I know is that tonight you were someone bleeding and in need of help. Who you are and what you've done is between you and God. Adrian said nothing. He just looked at her, for a long time, as if trying to carve her face into his memory. Then he lowered his head, and a soft laugh escaped his lips. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of someone realizing something they didn't know how to respond to. You're the strangest person I've ever met, Clara Bennett, he said. I've met thousands of people in my life. Everyone wants something from me. Money, power, protection. No one has ever given me anything without asking for something in return. Clara thought of her mother, of the lessons she'd lived by, of the poor bride with the torn wedding dress and her mother's words. Today you need a miracle, not a bill. Maybe you just hadn't met the right person, Clara said gently. Adrian looked up at her, and in the candlelight his gray eyes softened, warmed, like ice beginning to melt. Maybe not, he said. Maybe tonight I finally have. They sat in silence for a long while, with only the sound of rain outside and the soft crackle of burning candles. Clara felt her eyelids grow heavy, her body begging for rest after a day that had drained every ounce of strength from her. But she couldn't sleep, not with a wounded stranger sitting in her tailor shop. The clock on the wall read 3:45 in the morning when Adrian finally moved. He carefully tried to roll his shoulder, grimaced at the pain, then gave a small nod of satisfaction when he felt the stitches hold firm. He stood up slowly, one hand gripping the back of the chair to steady himself. I have to go, he said. My people will come for me. Clara rose as well, unsure what to say. She looked at him in his blood-stained shirt, one shoulder wrapped in gauze and strips of fabric she had torn from an old roll. He still looked dangerous, still mysterious, yet somehow fragile in a way she hadn't expected. Adrian slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of cash. She saw crisp $100 bills, heavy and dense, easily 50 of them. He placed the stack on the sewing table, right beside her mother's box of needles and thread. $5,000, he said, pushing the money toward her. You saved my life. This is the least I can do. Clara looked down at the money. $5,000. Enough to pay the electric bill, pay Jimmy's protection fee, buy Sophie's medicine, and still have enough left to breathe for a moment. The amount she needed so badly she could have fallen to her knees and begged for it, but she reached out and pushed the stack back toward Adrian. I can't take it, she said. Adrian frowned, his gray eyes darkening. Are you joking? You need this money. You're about to lose your shop. Your sister needs surgery, and you're saying you can't take it. I don't take money from someone who's bleeding, Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. You're injured. You're running from something. You need this money more than I do. Adrian stared at her as if she'd grown another head. Are you insane? Clara almost laughed, because it was the same question she'd been asking herself. Maybe she was insane, but she couldn't take his money. Not because of who he was or what he'd done, but because her mother had taught her that kindness wasn't a commodity to be bought or sold. Maybe I am, she replied, but I still won't take it. Adrian stood there in silence, the money resting on the table between them. He looked at her for a long time, his gray eyes unreadable. Then he picked up the cash and slid it back into his pocket. You really are different, Clara Bennett, he said quietly. I won't forget this. He walked to the door and Clara followed to unlock it. The rain had eased, leaving only a light drizzle. Outside, a sleek black car waited at the corner of the street, engine off, like a beast crouched in the shadows. Adrian paused at the threshold and turned back to look at her one last time. Thank you, he said, two simple words that carried weight, as if he wasn't used to saying them. Then he disappeared into the night, his tall figure fading into the pale morning mist. Clara stood in the doorway, watching until the black car glided away without a sound. She closed the door, locked it, and leaned back against the wall. Her hands were still smeared with dried blood. Her heart was still racing. What had she just done? She had just refused $5,000. $5,000 she desperately needed. She looked down at her trembling fingers. Mom, I hope I did the right thing. Inside the black car, Adrian sat in silence in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the small tailor shop growing more distant through the window. Tony Mancini, the man behind the wheel, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Are you all right, boss? Adrian didn't answer right away. He was thinking about those steady brown eyes, about blood-stained hands pushing the money back, About the words, "I don't take money from someone who's bleeding." "Find out everything about her," Adrian finally said, his voice returning to its usual cold edge. "Clara Bennett. Bennett Tailoring. I want to know everything by noon tomorrow." Tony nodded without asking a single question. After 30 years working for the Corsetti family, he knew exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. Clara slept for only 2 hours. She woke when the first sunlight slipped through the gap in the curtains, her body feeling as if it hadn't rested at all. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if what had happened the night before had been a dream. But when she looked down at her hands and saw dried blood still beneath her fingernails, she knew it was real. She had saved a stranger. She had refused $5,000. She was still drowning in debt, and today Jimmy would come back for his money. Sophie had woken before her and was sitting at the small table doing homework. The girl looked up when she saw Clara, worry in her eyes. "You slept very late. I heard noises downstairs last night. What happened?" Clara forced a smile and said it was nothing, just finishing an urgent order, then asked if Sophie had eaten. Sophie shook her head and said she was waiting. Clara went to the kitchen to make breakfast. She opened the refrigerator and found it empty, realizing she hadn't made it to the store the day before. She searched the cabinet and found only one last packet of noodles. She cooked them and divided them into 2 bowls, Sophie's portion still larger. They ate in silence. Clara looked out the window at the fully risen morning, pale autumn sunlight spilling across the street. A normal day was beginning, yet she had a feeling nothing about today would be normal. Sophie left for school at 7:30. Clara kissed her forehead, told her to be careful, then went downstairs to the shop. She cleaned up what remained from the night before. The bloodied gauze, the nearly empty bottle of alcohol, loose threads on the floor. She wiped the blood from the chair and the floor, erasing every trace as if the night had never happened. At 8, she flipped the sign to open. At 9, Mrs. Romano came to collect her altered dress. Clara handed it over, took the $10, and forced a smile while her thoughts tangled inside her chest. 10 o'clock. 11 o'clock. Time crawled like torture. Clara sat by the sewing machine and tried to work, but her hands kept shaking. She thought of Jimmy, of his threat, of 10 o'clock that night. 12 hours left. 12 hours to find $500 she didn't have. Then she heard engines, not one car but several, smooth and refined, a sound that didn't belong in this poor neighborhood. Clara looked through the glass, and her heart skipped. 6 black Maybachs rolled slowly onto the narrow street, parking along the curb in front of her shop and blocking the sunlight. 6 cars, jet black, polished like mirrors, the kind she'd only seen in films or magazines, worth a fortune. Doors opened and men stepped out. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted 12 in total. All wore black suits, all were tall, all had faces cold as stone. They formed a line in front of the tailor shop like soldiers awaiting orders. Neighbors peeked from windows. Mrs. Thompson across the street hurriedly pulled her curtains shut. Mr. Miller next door slammed his door closed. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Clara stood frozen behind the counter, unable to move. She didn't know who these men were, but she knew they were here for her, and she knew it was connected to the man from the night before. The shop door opened. An older man entered, hair graying, face lined with age, eyes sharp as blades. He stopped at the counter and bowed his head to Clara with unexpected respect. "Miss Bennett." Clara nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "I am Tony Mancini," he said, his voice deep and polite. "Mr. Adrian Corsetti would like to see you." Clara's heart raced. Adrian Corsetti. She remembered gray eyes in candlelight, the wound she had stitched, the money she had refused. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Mr. Corsetti is the man you saved last night," Tony replied, something like a smile flickering across his lips. "And he is the head of the Corsetti family, the most powerful family on the east coast of the United States." Clara felt the world spin. Family, powerful, East Coast. The words collided in her mind. She had saved a Mafia boss. She had refused a Mafia boss's money. The last car door opened. Adrian Corsetti stepped out, dressed in a flawless charcoal 3-piece suit as if the gunshot and blood of the night before had never existed. His left shoulder moved a little stiffly, the only sign of the wound she had sewn. He walked into the shop, gray eyes finding her brown ones. "Good morning, Clara," Adrian said, his voice warmer than she remembered. "I owe you a conversation." Adrian signaled to Tony Mancini and the other men waiting outside, and they stepped back, closing the shop door and leaving Adrian and Clara facing each other in the small space. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass, so different from the flickering candlelight of the night before. Yet Adrian's gray eyes were just as sharp as she remembered. Clara stood behind the counter, her hands unconsciously gripping the edge as if searching for support, forcing her voice to stay steady while her heart pounded like a war drum. "You're Mafia," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Adrian didn't deny it. He pulled out a chair and sat down, the same chair he had occupied the night before while she stitched his wound, moving slowly as if giving her time to adjust to his presence. "I am the head of the Corsetti family," he said evenly, like he was reading a news report. "My father built this empire 50 years ago. He died when I was 23, and I inherited everything. It's been 13 years since then." Clara swallowed. 13 years leading a mafia family. She couldn't imagine what he had done in those 13 years. "Last night," she asked, her voice rough. "What happened?" Adrian studied her for a moment, weighing how much to say, then exhaled. "Betrayal," he replied. "The man I trusted most, my right hand for 10 years, sold me out to my enemies, Victor Strauss. He set up a fake meeting and led me into a trap. I was shot, nearly died, and ran all night until I found your tailor shop." Clara thought of the fearful gray eyes behind the glass the night before, the hoarse voice begging for help, the bullet tearing through his shoulder. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast had nearly died and found salvation in her tiny tailor shop. "What about Victor now?" she asked, not sure she wanted the answer. Adrian looked at her without blinking. "He's hiding, but not for long." Clara understood and didn't ask more. Adrian shifted back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her. "I looked into you," he said. Clara stiffened. "Looked into me. Everything." Adrian nodded without shame. "I know you're 27. I know your mother died 2 years ago from cancer, leaving $28,000 in medical debt. I know your sister is 14, born with a heart condition, needing surgery within 3 months that costs $80,000, with insurance covering only part of it." Clara felt violated. This was her private life, the secrets she guarded, the pain she didn't want anyone to see, and he had unearthed it all in one night. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I needed to know who saved my life," Adrian replied without remorse. "In my world, trusting someone without knowing who they are can get you killed. But I didn't save you to be investigated like a criminal." "I know," Adrian said, his tone softening slightly, "and what I found only left me more confused." Clara watched him, waiting. Adrian continued, his voice low. "I found a woman drowning in debt, about to have her electricity cut off, being threatened by debt collectors, extorted by a local gang, with a sister who needs money to live and no way to get it. And yet she opened her door to a bleeding stranger, spent 4 hours stitching his wounds, and refused $5,000 he offered." He paused, gray eyes locking onto hers. "Do you know that in all my 13 years doing this, I've never met anyone like you?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. Adrian stood and walked toward the sewing table, where her mother's photograph hung on the wall. He studied it for a long time, as if reading the story behind the woman's smile in the frame. "My mother was kind too," he said, his voice drifting somewhere far away. "She died when I was 12. My father never recovered. He became colder, crueler, and he taught me to become the same. I forgot there were still people like my mother, like your mother, like you." He turned back to Clara. "Last night, you reminded me." Clara felt her heart soften despite herself. She didn't want to sympathize with a mafia boss, didn't want to see the man behind the ruthless shell. But the gray eyes speaking of his mother weren't cold. They were wounded, lonely, just like the eyes she saw in the mirror every night. "I want to repay you," Adrian said, his voice turning firm and decisive again. "I will pay off your mother's medical debt, $28,000, completely erased. I will cover the full cost of Sophie's surgery, $80,000, at the best hospital with the best doctors. I will take care of the jackals. Jimmy Kowalski will never set foot on this street again. And I will invest in your tailor shop, help you expand it, so you never have to worry about money again." Clara stood frozen. She heard every word, but her mind couldn't process them. Erased debt, Sophie saved, the gang gone, the shop secure. Everything she prayed for every night, everything she believed she would never have, was being laid before her. "In return for what?" she asked, her voice dry. Adrian tilted his head, genuinely surprised. "Nothing," he said. "You saved my life without asking for anything. I'm repaying you the same way." Clara looked at Adrian, at the gray eyes waiting for her answer. She thought of Sophie, of her sister's fragile heart, of the 3 months counting down relentlessly. She thought of the crushing debts, of Jimmy and his threat to burn the shop down, of a future with no clear path forward. All of it could be solved with a single nod. If she just said yes, everything would change. Sophie would have her surgery. The debts would disappear. The gang would be gone. She would finally be able to breathe. But she shook her head. "I can't accept it," she said, her voice gentle but unyielding. Adrian frowned, surprise flashing briefly across his face, before it settled back into its usual cold mask. "This is the second time you've refused me," he said, his tone edged with disbelief. "Do you know that no one refuses me twice and stays alive?" Clara swallowed but didn't step back. "Then I'll be the first." Adrian stared at her. "Why? You need this money. Your sister needs to be saved. You're about to lose everything. And you still say no. Because it's Mafia money," Clara answered plainly. "I don't know how you earn your money, but I doubt it comes from selling flowers or running a bakery. I don't want Sophie to be saved with blood-stained money." Adrian fell silent. His jaw tightened, but he wasn't angry. In his gray eyes there was something like reluctant respect. "Do you know what you're turning down?" he asked quietly. "I do," Clara replied. "I'm turning down the only chance to save my sister. I'm turning down a way out of the hell I'm living in." She paused and drew a deep breath. "But my mother taught me that some things are worth more than money. Integrity is one of them. If I take your money, I won't be the person my mother wanted me to be. Sophie wouldn't want to be saved at that price." She glanced up at her mother's photograph on the wall, as if drawing strength from it. "I'd rather die clean than live in the mud." Adrian stood there in silence for a long moment. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but with the sound of someone who had just encountered something so rare it was almost unbelievable. "You really are crazy," he said, but his voice wasn't cold anymore. "Crazy in the most beautiful way I've ever seen." Clara didn't answer. She simply stood there, waiting for him to leave, waiting for the nightmare to end so she could return to facing her miserable reality. But Adrian didn't leave. He stepped closer, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "All right," he said. "I respect your decision. I won't force you to take the money, but there's one thing you can't refuse." Clara looked at him warily. "What?" "Jimmy Kowalski and the Jackals," Adrian said, his voice hard as steel. "They'll never touch you again. That's not a gift. That's something I have to do." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Adrian raised a hand to stop her. "You saved my life," he said. "In my world, life is repaid with life. You don't want the money. Fine. But you can't stop me from protecting the person who saved me. That's principle, not generosity." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say she didn't need protection from the Mafia, but she thought of Jimmy, of the threat to burn the shop, of Sophie sleeping upstairs every night. She couldn't protect her sister alone. She knew that, and she hated herself for knowing it. "I don't want anyone killed," she said softly but clearly. Adrian tilted his head. "No one will die," he replied. "Jimmy will receive the message that you're under the protection of the Corsetti family. He'll disappear from your life. Trust me, for men like him, hearing my name is enough." Clara studied him, searching his face for any sign of a lie. His gray eyes didn't flicker or look away. He was telling the truth, at least about this. "And the other things?" Clara asked. "The medical debt, the surgery money." Adrian smiled, the first smile she'd seen that wasn't born of pain or sarcasm. "They're still here," he said. "Whenever you change your mind, you know how to find me." He placed a black business card on the sewing table, bearing only a phone number, no name, no address. Then he turned and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back at her one last time. "You're a remarkable woman, Clara Bennett," he said. "I hope I'll see you again." The door closed. The engines of the Maybachs started, then slowly faded away. Clara stood alone in the tailor shop, staring at the black card on the table, wondering what she had just done with her life. At 10 o'clock that night, Jimmy the Rat didn't come. Clara sat in the shop, her heart pounding wildly, waiting for the violent knock on the door, waiting for the threats, waiting for the stench of gasoline and the sound of fire. But nothing happened. The night passed in silence. The next day, Clara heard the news from Mrs. Romano. The Jackals gang had vanished from the neighborhood. Jimmy Kowalski was last seen loading his belongings onto a truck, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. He left South Boston overnight without a single explanation. The entire gang went with him, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. No one knew what had happened, but Clara knew. She looked down at the black card still hidden in the drawer of her sewing table, and she knew. Adrian Corsetti had kept his word. In the days that followed, Clara tried to return to a normal life. She still opened the shop every morning, still sewed for her customers, still gave discounts to Mrs. Romano, and worked for Mr. Walsh without charge. The electricity was still cut off, forcing her to use candles every night. The debts were still piling up. The collection company still called every day. Sophie still needed surgery, and Clara still had no idea where the money would come from. But at least she no longer had to fear her home being burned down every night. 1 week after the Maybachs appeared, Adrian came back. Not with a grand convoy, just a single black car parked quietly at the corner of the street at 9 o'clock in the evening. He stepped into the shop while Clara was sewing by candlelight, alone, with Sophie already asleep upstairs. "I need an alteration," he said from the doorway. Clara looked up, startled to see him. "Your suit is perfect," she said. Adrian glanced down at the expensive 3-piece suit he was wearing, then back at her. "Then I need a cup of tea." Clara didn't know how to react. She stood up and made tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the water. He sat in the familiar chair and looked around the tailor shop in the candlelight. "Still no power," he remarked. "I'm arranging it," Clara replied, setting the cup in front of him. "I should be able to pay next week." Adrian said nothing. He drank his tea and watched her work. They sat in silence for a long time, with only the sound of the needle-piercing fabric and the soft crackle of the candles. Strangely, Clara didn't feel uncomfortable. His presence wasn't threatening the way she had imagined. It was almost peaceful. That was the first time, but not the last. The following week, Adrian came again, and the week after that, each time around 9 in the evening, after Sophie had gone to sleep, each time alone, no bodyguards, no entourage. He sat, drank tea, watched her work, and they began to talk. At first it was only polite conversation, how work was going, what the weather was like, whether Sophie was feeling well. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Adrian spoke about his childhood, about his mother, a gentle woman who loved flowers and music, and never belonged to the underworld her husband inhabited. About her death when he was 12, a car accident he still suspected wasn't an accident. About his father, a ruthless man who turned a grieving child into a weapon. Clara listened. She didn't judge, didn't condemn, didn't pity. She simply listened, the way her mother used to listen to customers who came to the tailor shop to unburden their hearts. And Clara began to share as well, about her mother, about the lessons she had taught her, about Sophie and her heart condition, about the nightly fear of losing her sister, about the loneliness of carrying everything on her own. Adrian listened. His gray eyes were no longer cold when he looked at her. They were warmer, softer, like ice slowly melting in the sun. One night, Clara asked him why he kept coming here. Adrian looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because this is the only place where I feel at peace," he said. "My world is full of people who want to kill me, people who want to use me, people who fear me so much they can't even meet my eyes. But you're different. You look at me like I'm a human being, not a mafia boss, not a killer, just a man." Clara didn't know what to say. She only knew her heart was beating faster than it should, and that frightened her. She couldn't fall in love with a mafia boss. She wasn't allowed to fall in love with a mafia boss. But when Adrian left that night, when the black car disappeared at the end of the street, Clara realized she was waiting for the next week, waiting for him to return, waiting for the candlelit conversations, waiting for the gray eyes that looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And she knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but she couldn't stop herself. 3 months passed like a dream. Clara was still poor, still drowning in debt, still terrified about finding the money for Sophie's surgery. But something had changed. Every week she had one night to look forward to. Every week a man with gray eyes stepped into her small tailor shop, sat in the familiar chair, and made her feel less alone. Adrian didn't come only to talk. He helped quietly in ways Clara couldn't refuse. The electric bill was paid by an anonymous source. The grocery store at the end of the street suddenly began delivering free food every week, claiming she had won some promotion. Sophie's medication was discounted by 70% for reasons no one could explain. Clara knew it was Adrian. She wanted to be angry, wanted to refuse, but she couldn't return what had already been used, and deep down she was grateful, even if she never said it aloud. Sophie began to notice the difference. "You smile more lately," she said one day. "Is something making you happy?" Clara only smiled and didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain to her 14-year-old sister that she was developing feelings for a Mafia boss. The night everything changed was an ordinary Saturday night. Adrian was sitting in the shop, drinking tea, watching Clara sew a dress for a client. Sophie had gone to bed at 9. The candles flickered on the table, creating a warm and intimate space. "Do you know I've been watching you?" Adrian suddenly asked. Clara looked up, startled. "Watching?" Adrian nodded, his expression serious. "2 of my men are always near this shop, 24/7, to protect you and Sophie." Clara was about to respond when Adrian's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and his brows drew together. He answered, and Clara watched his face change. It went cold, hard, returning to the Mafia boss she had met that first night. When Adrian asked into the phone, his voice icy. "How many? From which direction?" He hung up and stood abruptly. "Clara, bring Sophie down here now." "What's happening?" Clara asked, her heart beginning to race. "Victor," Adrian said, his gray eyes darkening. "He's back, and he's coming here." The blood seemed to freeze in Clara's veins. Victor Strauss, the traitor who had nearly killed Adrian 3 months earlier. The man Adrian had said was in hiding. "He knows about me?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Adrian looked at her, and in his gray eyes she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for her. "He knows you're my weakness," Adrian said. "He's coming with 15 gunmen. My people are trying to stop them, but they won't make it in time. We have about 5 minutes. Clara didn't wait for more. She ran upstairs and shook Sophie awake. Her sister opened her eyes, groggy. "Sister, what's wrong?" "Get up," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay calm even though her hands were shaking. "Come downstairs with me." Quickly, Sophie didn't ask anything else. She was used to obeying her sister in emergencies. She pulled on her jacket and followed Clara down the stairs. Adrian was standing at the shop door, phone to his ear, issuing orders in a voice hard as steel. "Tony, gather everyone. I need them here in 10 minutes. "No, we don't have 10 minutes. Just try." He ended the call and turned to Clara and Sophie. His eyes settled on the 14-year-old girl clinging to her sister, trembling. He stepped forward and knelt to Sophie's eye level. "You're Sophie, right?" he asked, his voice gentler than Clara had ever heard. "Don't be afraid. I'll protect you and your sister." Sophie stared at him with wide eyes. "Who are you?" "I'm your sister's friend," Adrian said, "and I promise I won't let anyone hurt either of you." Sophie nodded and clutched Clara's hand tighter. Just then, engines roared outside. Tires screeched. Car doors slammed. Footsteps ran. Adrian stood and pulled Clara and Sophie behind the counter. "Stay down here," he said. "Don't come out no matter what happens." Clara pulled Sophie down behind the counter and wrapped her arms tightly around her. She looked up and saw Adrian draw a gun from inside his suit. It was the first time she had seen him holding a weapon, and it reminded her who he truly was. The shop door burst open. A man walked in, followed by dozens of dark figures carrying guns. The man in front had blonde hair, sharp features, and a smile as cold as a snake. Victor Strauss. "Hello, Adrian," Victor said, as if greeting an old friend. "Long time no see. I hear you've got a special woman here. I came to take a look." Adrian stood between Victor and the counter where Clara and Sophie were hiding. His body was taut like a drawn wire, gun aimed straight at Victor, but 15 other guns were aimed at him. "Let her go," Adrian said, his voice icy with something trembling beneath it. "This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with it." Victor laughed. "Nothing to do with it. You visit her every week. You have men guarding her 24/7. You, Adrian Corsetti, the ghost, the man with no weaknesses, have a weakness, and that weakness is hiding behind that counter." Clara held Sophie tighter, feeling her sister's heart pounding wildly against her chest. Sophie was terrified. So was she, but she couldn't let her sister see it. Victor stepped past Adrian toward the counter. Adrian moved to block him, but Victor's gunmen restrained him, guns pressed to his head. "Let me show you," Victor said as he yanked Clara upright by her hair. She screamed in pain. Sophie shrieked, "This is the price of betraying the family, Adrian." Victor pressed his gun to Clara's temple. "You kill her, or I kill her. Choose." Clara looked into Adrian's gray eyes and saw the pain there, the desperation, and something deeper she didn't dare name. The gun was still pressed to her temple, cold and final. Sophie was crying in the corner, held tightly by one of the gunmen. "Don't touch my sister," Clara said through clenched teeth. forcing her voice to stay steady even as her heart shattered. "Do whatever you want to me, but don't touch Sophie." Victor laughed, the sound like claws scraping glass. How touching. Two sisters who love each other. He turned to Adrian. "So what's it going to be, Adrian? Save your lover or save your own life?" Adrian stood there with two guns pressed to his head, but his eyes never left Clara. And in that moment she saw what stole the breath from her lungs. Adrian wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing her. "Let her go," Adrian said, his voice low and unbreakable. "I'll do anything you want. I'll hand over control of the family. I'll disappear. I'll die if you want. Just let her and her sister go." Clara heard every word, and it felt as if her heart were being crushed in a fist. He was trading everything, his empire, his power, his life, all of it, just to save her. Victor tilted his head as if considering it, then shook it. "Not enough," he said. "I want you to suffer before you die. I want you to watch her die in my hands first." His finger tightened on the trigger. Clara closed her eyes. She thought of Sophie, of her mother, of Adrian, and the nights they spent talking by candlelight. If this was the end, at least she had lived a decent life. The gunshot rang out, but Clara didn't feel pain. She opened her eyes to see Victor staggering, the gun falling from his hand. Blood poured from his wrist where a bullet had just torn through. Adrian had moved, so fast no one had time to react. He knocked aside the men holding him, shot Victor's hand, and threw himself in front of Clara like a wall. "Tony Mancini." Clara heard someone shout from outside. The shop door burst open again, and dozens of men in black suits flooded in like a tide. Adrian's men had arrived. Chaos exploded. Gunfire, screams, shattering glass. Clara crawled to Sophie and shielded her sister with her body. She closed her eyes, clutched Sophie tight, and prayed for the nightmare to end. Then there was silence. Slowly, Clara opened her eyes. The tailor shop was in ruins, glass everywhere, blood smeared on the walls. Victor's gunmen lay scattered, subdued or restrained. Victor Strauss knelt in the center of the floor, hands cuffed behind his back, blood still streaming from his wrist, his face twisted with pain and hatred. Adrian stood before him, gun still in hand, gray eyes cold as ice. "You've lost, Victor," Adrian said without emotion. "This time you won't escape." Victor laughed, blood on his lips. "You think you've won. You've exposed your weakness. The entire underworld will know Adrian Corsetti has a woman. Others will come. Others will try to hurt her. You can't protect her forever." Adrian didn't reply. He signaled for his men to take Victor away. When only Adrian, Clara, Sophie, and Tony Mancini remained, Adrian turned back. He knelt in front of the sisters, his gray eyes softening as he looked at them. "Are either of you hurt?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Clara shook her head, tears welling. "No, we're all right." Sophie looked up at Adrian with tear-filled eyes. "You saved us," she said, her voice trembling. "You stood in front of my sister. You almost died for us." Adrian smiled faintly, the first smile Clara had seen since Victor arrived. "I promised I'd protect you both," he said. "I always keep my promises." Clara looked at him, at the gray eyes filled with concern and care, at the man who had been ready to give up everything to save her, and she understood. She loved him. She, Clara Bennett, a poor tailor in South Boston, had fallen in love with Adrian Corsetti, the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast. It was insane, dangerous, impossible, and it was the truth. "I'm sorry," Adrian said quietly. "I dragged you into my world. I put you and Sophie in danger. Victor was right. There will be others. I can't protect you if you stay here." Clara knew what he was about to say. He would ask her to leave, to cut ties, to be safe, and she knew her answer. "Take us with you," Clara said. Adrian looked up, startled. "What?" "Take us somewhere safe," Clara repeated. "You said you have a penthouse, heavily guarded. Take me and Sophie there until this is over." Adrian stared at her. "Do you know what that means?" he asked. "Living in my world." "I know," Clara replied, lifting her hand to touch his cheek. "And I don't care anymore. You saved our lives. You were willing to die for us. If that isn't love, I don't know what is." Adrian's eyes widened as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Clara," he whispered her name like a prayer. "Take us home." "Adrian," Clara said. Sophie spoke up beside her, her voice small but firm. "I want to go with Adrian too," she said. "He's a good person. Bad people don't stand in front of others to take bullets. Adrian looked at the two sisters, and for the first time in his life, Clara saw his eyes shine with tears. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "I'll take you both home." Adrian's penthouse sat atop the tallest and most exclusive building in Boston, and when the elevator doors opened, Clara and Sophie froze in place. Clara had never seen anything like this in real life. The ceiling soared overhead, framed by floor-to-ceiling glass that revealed the entire city skyline. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors. The interior was minimalist, yet every piece radiated a kind of wealth beyond measure. Sophie squeezed Clara's hand, eyes wide. "Sister, is this a home or a 5-star hotel?" she whispered. Adrian smiled. One of those rare smiles Clara had learned appeared only when he was with them. "This is home," he said, "and from now on, it's your home too." In the first days, Clara couldn't sleep. The room she shared with Sophie was 3 times larger than the old apartment above the tailor shop. The bed was so soft she felt as if she were sinking into it. Everything was too quiet, too unfamiliar, too far removed from the life she had known. But gradually, she adapted. And what helped her adapt wasn't the luxury or comfort. It was Adrian. He changed. Or rather, he showed her the sides of himself he hid from the rest of the world. Every morning, Adrian had breakfast with the sisters. Not the rushed meals of a busy crime boss, but slow breakfasts with coffee, toast, and small talk. Sophie chatted about school, about friends, about math tests, and Adrian listened as if nothing in the world mattered more. In the afternoons, while Sophie did her homework, Adrian taught her how to play chess. Clara sat nearby, watching them lean over the board together, her heart warming in ways she hadn't expected. Sophie laughed more. Color returned to her cheeks. Even her breathing grew steadier, as if the absence of constant fear and financial worry had eased the burden on her fragile heart. One day, while waiting for Adrian to make his move, Sophie asked him why he lived alone in such a big place. Adrian looked at her, a fleeting sadness crossing his gray eyes. "Because I had no one to live with," he replied. "Until now." Sophie smiled, the innocent smile of a child untouched by the darkness in his past. "Now you have us," she said. "I'll stay here with you." Adrian glanced at Clara, and she saw it in his eyes. Hope, fragile and cautious, as if he feared that if he hoped too much, it would shatter. On the 12th night at the penthouse, Clara couldn't sleep. She slipped out of bed, wrapped a robe around herself, and stepped onto the balcony. The city stretched out beneath her, millions of lights flickering like falling stars. The night air was cool but gentle, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. "Can't sleep either," Adrian's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him at the balcony door, wearing a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his black hair slightly tousled. He looked softer, younger, less like a feared Mafia boss than ever. "I'm not used to it," Clara said. "Everything is too quiet. I miss the noise of the neighborhood." "You miss the tailor shop?" Adrian asked. "I miss everything," Clara replied. "The sound of the sewing machine, the church bells every morning, Mrs. Romano telling her stories. That was my life for 27 years. Adrian was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice light as the night breeze. "Do you regret coming here with me?" Clara turned to him and looked into his gray eyes, waiting for her answer as if his whole life depended on it. "No," she said. "I don't regret it." Adrian exhaled, as though a massive weight had been lifted from his chest. "Clara," he said quietly, "I'm not good at this. I don't know how to love. No one ever taught me, but when I'm with you, I want to learn. I want to be better. I want to." He paused, searching for words. Clara lifted her hand to his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin. "What do you want?" she asked softly. Adrian looked at her, his gray eyes bright under the city lights. "I want you," he said. "Not because you saved my life, not because you're the best person I've ever known, but because when I'm with you, I don't feel like a monster anymore. You make me believe I can change." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She drew him down to her, and their lips met in their first kiss, gentle and hesitant, like two people learning how to trust. Adrian wrapped his arms around her, and Clara felt safe. For the first time since her mother died, for the first time after all the lonely and terrifying nights, she felt she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. "You belong here," Adrian whispered into her hair. "You belong with me." Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "And you belong with me," she replied. 2 weeks after that night on the balcony, Adrian finished dealing with Victor Strauss. Clara didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know. She only knew that one morning Adrian came home looking lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders, and told her it was over. Victor was on his way to federal prison, charged on the strength of extensive evidence that Adrian's people had quietly gathered and delivered to the FBI. There was no blood spilled. There was no death. There was only justice, in Adrian's own way. "You're safe now," he said, sitting down beside Clara on the sofa. "No one will threaten you or Sophie again." Clara looked at him and saw the dark circles beneath his eyes from too many sleepless nights, saw the exhaustion in his broad shoulders. He had fought to protect her. He had traded away more than she could ever know. "Thank you," she said, taking his hand. Adrian shook his head. "Don't thank me," he replied. "This is what I had to do, and I'd do it 1,000 times over if I had to." In the days that followed, Adrian began to change many things, not only for Clara, but because he wanted to become a man worthy of her. He started withdrawing from the family's illegal operations, gradually shifting toward legitimate businesses, real estate, restaurants, hotels, things that were clean, things that could stand in the light without shame. Tony Mancini, who had followed Adrian for 30 years, was the first to notice. "You're different, boss," Tony said one day. "Softer, but stronger too." "It's strange." Adrian looked out the window, where Clara and Sophie were playing chess in the living room. "She makes me want to be better," he replied, "and I'll do anything to be worthy of her." A month later, Adrian offered investing in Clara's tailor shop. This time, she didn't refuse, because this time he didn't give her money. He invested, legally, transparently, with funds from the clean companies he was building. Bennett Tailoring expanded to 3 times its former size. Clara hired 12 additional employees, all women in difficult circumstances who needed stable work. She opened a free vocational training program for the unemployed. She began sewing clothes at no cost for people who needed outfits for job interviews but couldn't afford decent ones. "Your mother would be proud of you," Adrian said, standing in the newly renovated shop, watching Clara guide a new employee. Clara smiled, her eyes filling with tears as she looked up at the photo of her mother still hanging on the wall, the only thing she had brought from the old shop. "I hope so," she replied. But the most important moment was still ahead, Sophie's surgery. Adrian arranged everything. The best hospital in Boston, one of the top cardiac surgeons in the United States, a private room with every comfort. $80,000 was paid in advance, and this time Clara didn't object, because this was Sophie's life. This was the only thing more important than her pride. On the morning of the surgery, Clara sat beside Sophie's bed, holding her sister's hand. Sophie looked at her, eyes heavy from the pre-anesthesia medication. "Don't worry," Sophie said weakly. "I'll be fine. I still have to become a doctor." Clara laughed through her tears. "Yes, you'll be fine. I believe in you." Sophie turned to Adrian, standing nearby. "Adrian, you promise you'll take care of my sister if I don't wake up, okay?" "Don't say that," Adrian said, kneeling down and taking the little hand in his own. "You'll wake up, I promise. And when you do, I'll teach you the chess move I've been hiding all this time." Sophie smiled, a weak but trusting smile. Then they wheeled her into the operating room and the door closed. Clara stared at the stark white door, her legs threatening to give out. Adrian caught her, guided her to the waiting chairs. They sat there, hand in hand, for 8 hours that felt eternal. Clara didn't cry. She didn't dare. She just sat there, staring into nothingness, praying. Adrian sat beside her, silent, holding her hand tightly. His presence was all she needed. When Dr. Morrison stepped out of the operating room, Clara sprang to her feet, her heart stopping in her chest. The doctor removed his mask, and she saw the smile on his face. "The surgery was a success," he said. "Sophie will be healthy. Her heart has been fully repaired. She'll live a normal life." Clara stood there, unable to speak. She heard every word, but her mind couldn't process them. Success, healthy, normal life, words she had dreamed of for so many years. Then her legs gave way, and she cried. For the first time since her mother died, she truly cried. Not from pain, but from relief, from happiness, because finally, after all the sleepless nights of worry, after all the desperate prayers, her sister would live. Adrian held her as she cried against his chest. He didn't say a word. He just held her, letting her know she wasn't alone anymore. "You did it, Clara," Adrian whispered into her hair. "You saved Sophie." Clara shook her head in his arms. "We saved Sophie," she said through her sobs. "Thank you. Thank you for everything." Adrian kissed the top of her head, and Clara felt his tears fall into her hair. The man who hadn't cried since he was 12 years old was crying. For her, for Sophie, for the first time in his life, because he finally had a family to love. 1 year later, Bennett Tailoring was no longer a small shop on a corner in South Boston. It had become a vocational training center with 3 locations across the city, 27 employees, and hundreds of people who had been helped to rediscover their faith in life. Clara stood in the main facility, looking around at everything she had built. Rows of brand new sewing machines gleamed under the lights. Rolls of fabric in every color lined the shelves. Employees worked diligently, all of them women who had once been trapped in hardship just like she had been. And on the wall, in the most honored place, her mother's photo still hung, her smile as gentle as ever. Sophie was now 15 years old, healthy and full of energy. She no longer gasped for breath when climbing stairs, no longer needed daily medication, no longer lived in fear that her heart might stop at any moment. She was in her first year of high school, dreaming of becoming a cardiologist. "I want to save children like I used to be," Sophie told Clara one day. "So no one has to be as afraid as you once were for me." Clara held her sister, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Adrian had changed too. He had completely withdrawn from the underworld, transferring control of the family to Tony Mancini. The Corsetti empire was now a legitimate business conglomerate with dozens of hotels, restaurants, and real estate companies. No more blood, no more darkness, only a man learning how to live in the light. On the 1-year anniversary of the day they met, Adrian took Clara back to the old tailor shop, the place where everything began. The shop had been transformed into a small museum, preserving memories of Clara's mother and the journey of the 2 sisters. The Singer sewing machine from 1982 still stood at the center, polished to a shine. "Do you know why I brought you here?" Adrian asked, holding Clara's hand. Clara shook her head, her heart racing with anticipation. Adrian knelt down, exactly where she had stitched his wound 1 year earlier. He pulled out a black velvet box and opened it. Inside lay a simple yet elegant diamond ring, sparkling under the lights. "1 year ago, you saved my life," Adrian said, his voice trembling slightly. "But in truth, you saved much more than that. You saved my soul. You gave me a reason to change. You gave me a family. Clara Bennett, will you be my wife, and let me spend my life by your side?" Clara cried and nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I do." Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to hold her tightly. They kissed in the old tailor shop, the place where her kindness had changed both their destinies. "I'll spend my entire life being worthy of you," Adrian whispered. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You already are," she replied. "From the moment you stood in front of Sophie and me to take a bullet, you were already worthy." That night, rain began to fall. As Clara was closing the main facility, she heard knocking at the door. Urgent, desperate, and strangely familiar. She opened it to see a young woman standing there, soaked, her eyes red from crying. "Please," the girl said through sobs. "I have a job interview tomorrow. I'm a single mother. My child needs me to work. My dress tore on the bus, and I don't have money to buy a new one. Please help me." Clara looked at the girl and saw herself from 1 year ago. Poor, desperate, but still fighting for the people she loved. She smiled and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll fix your dress for you, free of charge." The girl stared at her in disbelief. "Really? Why are you so kind to me?" Clara glanced at her mother's photo on the wall, then back at the young woman. "Because once, someone taught me that kindness isn't something to be bought or sold," she replied. "And 1 year ago, someone knocked on my tailor shop door on a rainy night, and I opened it. That changed my entire life. Now I'm just continuing that circle." Adrian walked in and saw Clara sewing a dress for the stranger. He didn't ask questions. He simply smiled, poured tea for the young woman, and sat down to wait for his future wife to finish her work, because he understood. This was Clara. This was the woman he loved. The woman who had saved him with unconditional kindness and continued to save others every day. Clara Bennett had refused $5,000 from a bleeding stranger and received an entire lifetime in return. Not money, not wealth, but love, family, and the chance to do good in the world. She proved that kindness never disappears. It simply travels in a circle and comes back bigger, more beautiful, and more meaningful. The story of Clara and Adrian is proof of a simple yet profound truth. In life, We can't control what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. We can choose kindness even in hardship. We can choose to help others even when we ourselves need help. And sometimes, one small act, one door opened on a rainy night, can change an entire destiny. Dear friend, if this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss meaningful stories each day. We want to hear from you. How do you feel about Clara and Adrian's story? Have you ever met a stranger and chosen to help them even when you were struggling yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Every experience matters, and we look forward to reading every word from the depths of your heart. Thank you for taking the time to watch today's video. We wish you and your family good health, joy, and peace each day. Remember, your kindness, no matter how small, can change someone's life. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.